Welcome to our next installment of Made Here, a series highlighting the remarkable achievements of our Mount Holyoke College alums. I am joined today by Rebecca Brenner Graham, class of 2015. Rebecca is the author of Dear Miss Perkins, a story of Frances Perkins's efforts to aid refugees from Nazi Germany. Her inspiring new narrative about the 1902 Mount Holyoke alum and the first woman to serve in a president's cabinet reveals the full, never-before-told story of her role in saving Jewish refugees during the Nazi regime. Rebecca is a postdoctoral research associate at Brown University. Previously, she taught at the Madeira School and American University. Rebecca has a PhD in history and an MA in public history from American University and a BA in history and philosophy from Mount Holyoke College. In 2023, she was awarded a Cokie Roberts Fellowship from the National Archives Foundation and the Rubenstein Center Research Fellowship from the White House Historical Association. Her writing has been published in the Washington Post, Time, Slate, Ms., the Los Angeles Review of Books, and elsewhere. Rebecca, thank you for being here. Rebecca, it's really good to see you. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for inviting me, President Holly. I've had the best 12 hours. I got to campus, I went to Thirsty Minds, I went to the Odyssey, I checked into Willits, I got dinner at Johnny's, and then I went to the library. So it's been a fantastic Mount Holyoke 12 hours.
You had the perfect Mount Holyoke 12 hours. That's exactly what I would do. If I only had 12 hours, I would definitely start at Thirsty Mind and go to Odyssey, et cetera. So that's wonderful. So tell me, why did you choose Mount Holyoke?
The transformative impact that Mount Holyoke has had on me is actually disproportionate to the several small reasons that I chose it. I am originally from Barrington, Rhode Island, which is an hour and a half to 2 hours away. When I went to college, my much younger siblings were in elementary school. I didn't want to go too far. I was looking for a small liberal arts college where the focus was on learning, and the professors actually knew your names, which they definitely did. Mountains are pretty, library is pretty. I was fortunate to have the $15,000 leadership award when I was deciding to come here. And also when I was applying to schools in 2010, Mount Holyoke was rated the #1 best classroom experience. And that's what I was really looking forward to in college, and it's what I had.
So I'm so excited that you're here to talk about your book on Frances Perkins, and we know that today is also Senior Symposium Day. So tell me a little bit about how you first discovered Frances Perkins when you came to Mount Holyoke and what it meant to you to learn more about her as you were here.
I was obsessed with history my whole life. I can't even pinpoint the origin, yet I had not heard of her. A lot of people have not heard of her. Yeah. I remember the first time I heard of her, which was when I was a first year at M&C's Under the Stars. We watched Dirty Dancing, as they still do. And the protagonist says, Frances, after the first woman in the cabinet, and everyone says woo, right? They woo. That was the first time I had heard of Frances Perkins, but then 2-3 years later, I was a junior looking for a summer internship and also hoping to find a senior thesis topic. I joke when I'm on book tour that the first line of this project was an email from the Mount Holyoke Career Development Center with a subject line, Paid American History Internship in Washington, D.C. It was funded by the Frances Perkins Center, facilitated by the Mount Holyoke Archives and Special Collections, and located in Washington, D.C. at the home of biographer Kirsten Downey, who wrote The Woman Behind the New Deal, which came out in 2009. My project was to organize her massive quantity of photocopied research for donation to the Mount Holyoke Archives. Basically, anything that could be legally accessioned went to Mount Holyoke, and everything else went to the Frances Perkins Center in Maine. While I was doing that project the summer between junior and senior year, I had kind of in the back of my mind that I wanted to do a senior thesis because I wanted to be a scholar. I wanted to apply to grad school. Kirsten Downey mentioned to me that there was more work to be done on the refugee policy aspect. She also taught me how to do archival research at the National Archives at College Park in Maryland outside of DC. And when I showed up in Professor Jeremy King's office hours with a stack of photocopied research from the National Archives, he agreed to work with me in an independent study capacity. That was my honors thesis. I did a separate topic for my PhD, and then a few weeks after my PhD in 2021, I found myself back on the trail of Frances Perkins's refugee policy because I hadn't learned everything yet.
That is such an exciting kind of, journey from your senior symposium all the way to your dissertation, all the way to this book. It's really incredible.
And genuinely made by Mount Holyoke, as you can hear from it.
I love that. I love that. So tell me about your work in the archives. I was a history major, as you know, too, and I love doing archival research. So tell me about your work with the Mount Holyoke Archives and what that really added to. I think one of the things we're thinking about is how student employment, right? How work that you do when you're a student can really impact the rest of your life. So tell us a little bit about your work in the archives.
My two jobs as an undergraduate were both in the philosophy department. I was very lucky to be both a grader and a book review assistant for a journal. I did do a tiny bit of archival research in the Mount Holyoke Archives when I was in college, but most of my research in the Mount Holyoke Archives was in spring 2023, after I had a PhD, after I had a book contract. And at that point, I had done research in many, many other archives for my dissertation, really in several archives across the country. The archivists at Mount Holyoke are the kindest. It's a really special environment where you can get up and get a tissue if you need one. I know that that sounds like a small thing, but in archives, that's not always the case. It's just like social, emotionally, and sensorily, it's the best archive. No offense to the other ones. I mean, I'm very grateful to the National Archives for a lot of reasons, but Mount Holyoke is the best, and they have one of my favorite Frances Perkins documents, too.
That's great. What's your favorite Frances Perkins document?
Yeah, so that's why I'm holding a piece of paper here so I get the quotation right. There are many great Frances Perkins documents, but there's one letter specifically that she wrote to her class in 1903, which was the year after she graduated in 1902. There's 3 reasons that I like this document. She had trouble finding a job after graduation. Many people did because there were not that many chances for employment for college-educated women. So she had to become a teacher, but that wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to work in social reform, which she ended up doing eventually. But first she wrote into her class that she was destined to stay at home, make her family miserable, and to kill her father with her cooking. So she didn't actually intend to kill her father, but like that means that she was discontent with traditional gender roles. And in that same document, she says that she was serving as a substitute teacher for Jewish immigrant children, and she writes, "You imagine how that could be," which just shows that she didn't know that many Jewish people. They were other to her, but she would meet more immigrant communities when she ended up in social reform work. Neither of those are the reason that it's my favorite document. At the end of the document, she writes this quotation, which I wrote down. She writes to her classmates, "Take my advice and go back when you can. It's grand, and if you use your imaginations, you'll believe that 1902 girls are under every cap and gown, and you won't be lonely."
Oh, I love that.
That's the feeling
amazing.
I always have on campus, too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I actually had never heard anyone reference that document. What a great treasure. That's why archival research is so great, right?
It should be referenced.
These really unexpected things. So as you said, many people don't know Frances Perkins, and if they do know her, they know her as the first woman to ever be in a president's cabinet. They know her as the longest serving Department of Labor secretary. They know her as an architect of the New Deal. But I think your book just takes us in a completely different direction. So tell us a little bit about your book and about this side of Frances Perkins that most of us have not heard about before.
Dear Miss Perkins is the first book-length treatment of her refugee policy. Previously, there was one academic article in the early 2000s by Botany Zucker. There are 2 chapters in The Woman Behind the New Deal about refugee policy. In the 1930s, Frances Perkins was the foremost advocate for German Jewish refugees in the Roosevelt administration. She comes up in other places too. There is an entry for her on the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's website, but this is the first book-length treatment. Maybe it won't be the last. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think, so what got you interested in refugee policy?
When I was Kirsten Downey's intern, she told me that there were thousands of letters at the National Archives at College Park in Maryland. People from all stages of Frances Perkins's life and career wrote to her on behalf of people that they knew that were trapped in Nazi territory. The Immigration Naturalization Service was under the Department of Labor from 1933 to 1940.
Oh, that's interesting
So-
that INS used to be organized
So
under
she
the Department of
created
Labor.
the INS.
She created the
So
INS.
before Frances Perkins was Secretary of Labor, the Immigration Bureau and the Naturalization Bureau were both in the Department of Labor, and under the Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover administrations, the Secretary of Labor used their resources and energy to deport people. And they said that it was protecting American jobs. But when Frances Perkins came in, she was not from the traditional rank and file labor union movements. She was part of a broader women's social reform network, many of whom were made by women's colleges, and they were pro-immigrant. So one of her first actions as Secretary of Labor was she asked President Roosevelt for an executive order that combines the Immigration Bureau and the Naturalization Bureau to create what's now the INS. She consolidated authority. She laid off the federally funded mob that would raid immigrant communities and deport them. She did smaller things too. She would set up rooms at Ellis Island so that social workers could advocate for individual immigrants. And she also made it, for a while, it actually didn't last, where INS employees would have to apply for a warrant to arrest someone instead of having rogue authority. So she created the INS, but in 1940, President Roosevelt did move it to the Department of Justice in anticipation of World War II and other reasons, and then it would stay there until the Department of Homeland Security in the 21st century.
That is fascinating. I don't know if you know, I was an administrative law professor. So I taught administrative law for, oh my gosh, almost 20 years before I stopped in legislation and regulation. So I did not know that INS was created by Frances Perkins. What a especially, I think, interesting telling of the history when we're in such a tumultuous period around immigration now. What do you think Frances Perkins would say about where we are with immigration now?
She, as a historical figure, in some ways is an antithesis to the current moment. The current moment includes many of the aspects that were in existence before her tenure as Secretary of Labor, but one thing that's different now is, well, ironically, Franklin D. Roosevelt expanded the size and reach of the executive branch,
Right.
which continued to expand throughout the 20th century. So in many ways, it's not comparable. One takeaway from my book is that even though there's one woman on the cover, that not one person can do everything. So like Frances Perkins's talent, well, one of them was that she worked creatively within the system to reform the system, but she needed activists outside the system. She needed journalists to tell her what was happening. She needed legal experts who would advise her. She had many of those.
That's really fascinating. So what do you think is the most interesting thing you found out about Frances Perkins during your research?
Oh, the most interesting, that's such a challenging question. I don't know if there's one most interesting. I think that the child refugee policy story was really compelling to me, and I've continued to hear from some readers who had personal family connections to the child refugee policy.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Basically, there was a partnership between the Children's Bureau and the INS within Perkins's Department of Labor with the German Jewish Children's Association, which was an activist organization from Jewish communities, and they brought over about 600 or 700 child refugees. Sometimes they would coordinate a whole ship just to bring one child. That was the spirit of the program. In the scheme of things, it was not a great quantity of lives saved, but those people found refuge, and their children in most cases are still alive.
That's what I was going to say. It's also powerful because we're coming to the end of the time where we have lots of people who survived the Holocaust with us. And so I would imagine that some of the child refugees are survivors, and then of course their children are still with us.
So one of the things that's so traumatic about child refugee policy is it inherently separates the children from the family. And so I read a couple examples, or even listened to their oral histories, where the child refugees didn't identify as Holocaust survivors, and then it ends up coming down to historical definitions. Because if they left in the mid-1930s, they might have survivor's guilt. Their parents died in the Holocaust. Most, if not all, of the child refugees' parents died in the Holocaust. But they might not identify that way. But if we're lucky, then they still gave their stories to oral history projects where we can hear them.
That's just invaluable. I think at times like these too, when you see museums and others that do these historical remembrances very much being challenged, I think it is so important to remind people why those spaces that have oral history, et cetera, are so critical to just democracy and what we can really expect here in the United States. So tell me, archival research is so interesting because I feel like you learn a lot about yourself, right? So you find documents like the one that you found, this letter to her classmates, that really says a lot for all alums, for all our Mount Holyoke alums. I'm sure many of them could write a similar letter to their classmates. So what did you learn about yourself as you were doing this archival research?
I fell in love with writing. I was always in love with history, but for me, research for me is a vehicle for writing, which is the process of making sense of what you found and making it readable, intelligible to more people. I just love writing because it's a form of expression. It's a form of translation to make the research, like I said, readable, intelligible, but also the people that I meet in the process. That's so invaluable to me, the places I got to go. I did a lot of research where I was living at the time in Washington, D.C., but also here at Mount Holyoke. In New York City, her personal papers are at Columbia, and then in Maine at the Francis Perkins Center. And just talking to people, I was a full-time high school history teacher at the time. I would listen to what my students had to say. I would listen to what my colleagues had to say about the topics in the book. Even examples like one of my colleagues, he learned about American immigration history through the Great American Melting Pot video from Schoolhouse Rock. Spoiler alert, it doesn't really get history right. And
still, Schoolhouse Rock was the best. It was.
Yeah. In the Great American Melting Pot, they just dive right in, and then they live in happiness.
Not quite as simple as they may. Even I'm just a Bill, I'm only a Bill. Things aren't that simple anymore. So tell us a little bit about this series. Is called Made Here, and it's supposed to really capture what are the things that happen for our graduates at Mount Holyoke that help them build, right? Both their lives, their professional lives, their personal lives. So what are the most important skills, talents, reflections that you took away from Mount Holyoke that help you come to the place where you are today?
At Mount Holyoke, in each classroom, the smartest, loudest person in the room is not the most privileged person in the world, because we're a gender diverse institution. And in most classrooms out there, and like I've been a TA and an instructor in other colleges, usually the loudest person that views themselves as the smartest, because no one's ever told them that they're not, is like a white man with many other privileges. And because Mount Holyoke is not that, it was a very special place to go. I remember one professor in particular, Katya Vavova in the philosophy department. She happens to be 10 years older than me and is a Mount Holyoke alumna. And I just thought she was the coolest. And like we've hung out now that I live back up here, I still think she's the coolest. And she treated students like they were thinkers just by being in her classroom, and that they could wear, it was all implicit, but like they could wear pajamas, and that didn't make them any less of a serious academic. And she really modeled that for us, even though she did not wear pajamas.
That's great. I know you were talking about how Frances Perkins was helped by other women, especially women's college grads. What is it specifically about Mount Holyoke being a women's college, a gender diverse women's college, that made a difference for you as you were studying here?
I felt like I could just exist here, and that helped me learn and study. I still feel that way when I'm on campus. I had the privilege of teaching for 4.5 years at the Madeira School, which is all-girls boarding school in Northern Virginia, and in many ways it's very similar. And I was in that job when I came here for a research trip in 2023. And at that point, I had been in grad school for a while. Grad school it happens to be sort of poverty wages. And then I came into the boarding school and thought like, oh wow, they have all the opportunities. But then when I stepped foot here, it really hit me that I had all of the opportunities, that I have all of the opportunities, and that I had them because I had the privilege of being a student here, because I had the privilege of my parents sending me here. And that really, I just felt overcome with gratitude when I realized that, stepping back on campus.
Yeah, it's really a incredibly special place. I think on a spring day like today, when you walk across campus and you see everyone, crossing to different places, and you get that feeling of real community, is what I love about Mount Holyoke. So, what's your favorite Mount Holyoke memory?
I'm going to tell you the one that I prepared for this, and then what I decided that it would be this morning at breakfast. So the memory that came to me when I thought about this question in advance was that on April 29th, 2015, the night before senior theses were due, me, 2 other history thesis writers, and a philosophy thesis writer holed up in, I believe, the Mead Hall common room, which was not my dorm at the time, and we were all finishing our footnotes, and it was one of 2 all-nighters in my entire academic career, just because footnotes take longer than you think. I reference them in the acknowledgments of my book. I call them the 4 a.m. footnotes group. I'm still in touch with all 3 of them. One of them, Emily Wells from my class, she and I are doing a conference panel this summer together. She's also a historian. So that came to mind. However,
that's fantastic.
And it is a good one. But this morning when I was at breakfast, pouring my coffee, seeing like the soft Mount Holyoke sweatshirts, seeing the diversity of Mount Holyoke students, my strongest memory, what makes me the most emotional, is just like the everyday sensory elements of getting to be a student on this campus. It's the coffee, it's the sweatshirts, it's the walk to class, seeing other people, how some of them are doing homework in the dining hall, how they have everything they need here to learn, to thrive, and to let Mount Holyoke push them into the rest of their lives.
I love that. The coffee and the soft sweatshirts, absolutely. I think those are the things that really triggered those, just core memories of what it's like to be here. So going back to your book examines Frances Perkins's work helping refugees, as we've talked about, and you write that, quote, as Secretary of Labor, she wrestled widespread anti-Semitism and isolationism, finding creative ways to work around quotas and restrictive immigration laws. Diligent, resilient, emphatic yet steadfast, she persisted on behalf of the desperate when others refused to act. I mean, what an incredible life story. What would you say kind of gave her that motivation to be so diligent, resilient, emphatic, yet steadfast?
It's difficult to measure what makes someone care. If we could measure that, we could convince others to care more easily. Something that's extraordinary about Frances Perkins is that she cared, that she tried, even when her hands were tied by laws passed from Congress and there was nothing she could do. She had some experiences, including her American Economic History professor at Mount Holyoke, Anna May Soul, was formative for her. Her experience volunteering at the settlement home in Chicago, Hull House, was formative for her. Witnessing the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire was traumatic for her. She watched people die. So through those experiences and her own personal disposition, she had the capacity to care about the suffering for people that she could not see. And there was some change over time, right? Like Hull House made her write back to her Mount Holyoke classmates, quote, "Social justice would be my vocation." The Triangle Factory fire, lots of scholars and writers have pontificated about this, that was indeed a formative moment for her that can't be overstated. But at the same time, Be Ye Steadfast was her class's motto in 1902, and it was also the biblical phrase that she asked to be included in her own funeral in 1965. So there is a continuity there. There are some core values that were hers personally. And she had to deal with so much. She kept herself grounded through her own Episcopalian religiosity and also through her close friendships, mostly with women.
That's really interesting. What do you think were the most important relationships she had with other women in terms of friendships?
Her closest friends in Washington were Mary Harriman Rumsey, who was her roommate, who actually died a couple years into the Roosevelt administration.
Oh, interesting.
That was really hard for Frances Perkins, very hard. And then Caroline O'Day was a congresswoman, another female trailblazer. They lived together at one point, too. She was friends with journalist Dorothy Thompson. She was friends with Gertrude Ely, who is a suffragist. Gertrude Ely had worked at Bryn Mawr, which was where Perkins's daughter, Susanna, went, and that was how they became friends.
Yeah, I always think you can understand a woman by her friendships a lot of times. Looking at the other women who she surrounds herself with, I think is one of the most interesting things you can know about a woman, especially a woman who spends a lot of time in public service. So let's talk about the humanities for a second. So, we were both history majors. You were a history and philosophy major, kind of at the heart of the humanities.
Yes.
And so much of what we do in higher education is under attack, including, I always have been giving this statistic recently, that only 22% of Americans believe that a college education is worth it if you have to take out any loans for the education, even though we know that so many people get just huge benefit from having a higher ed degree, and I think specifically a humanities degree. What would you say to people about the humanities and the importance of studying things like philosophy and history?
There are transferable skills for sure, like thinking and critical arguments and writing and communicating. But I also don't want to reduce the conversation to what is transferable. I think that there are intangible, ineffable components to it. Those are really hard to convince the naysayers. I think that my instinct is to defer to individual experiences. Someone can have a fantastic education in college that takes place outside of the classroom, right? Through their extracurriculars, through their friendships. Not everyone has to be a classroom learner. I think the crisis of higher education comes down to uneven allocation of resources more than anything else. So that is where I would see a solution. But many people, including Frances Perkins, back in the day have worked to reallocate resources, and we're still not there yet.
Yeah, say a little bit more about that, the crisis of reallocating resources or not having enough kind of allocation of resources in a way that may encourage more students.
It's just not fair, and it's unjust that not everyone has the resources to be as comfortable in college as I was. My parents would put money on my one card at Mount Holyoke so I could order a coffee from Thirsty Minds and go write my papers. I did have a merit scholarship here, but my parents paid for the rest of my college education, and that's the privilege that I'm overcome with gratitude when I'm here. Just so many people in the country are struggling to get by. So I would imagine that some of the reasons behind that statistic that you shared is they feel that they can't afford it, which is deeply sad.
And it's something that I think as higher ed institutions, we're in a period of deep, I think, thinking about not just what is our purpose. I think we know what our purpose is, but I think the question of how can we deliver education to as many students as possible so that people around the country and around the world really see this as a project that we're all in together.
Yes, I mean, on the separate issue of refugee policy, I'm thinking of how Frances Perkins used politics and how she drew on the energy and labor of activists and especially philanthropists. Like in this larger project of reallocating resources to make life more fair and just, there is a place for people who have affluence giving money. Mount Holyoke has been very privileged to have a robust alumni community. It's fierce and formidable, really, the alumni community. And then activists who are willing to go out and ask those people for money. Just like in the refugee policy story, there were mostly Jewish activists who were asking philanthropists to donate money to the refugee cause. And then people like Frances Perkins, or at Mount Holyoke, people like you who are here and working the politics of it and steering the ship.
Yeah, it's, alum giving, we have this incredibly formidable alum network, especially when it comes to supporting the college. And it is an act of politics, right? That's a really interesting observation, but especially in times like this, the choice to give to Mount Holyoke, to give to a place that's a women's college that does produce graduates like you and like Frances Perkins, is a political act to say this is what we believe in, right? We believe strongly in the mission of the college and the kind of graduates it produces, people who really go out and shake the world and make things better for other people. And so raising money in that way can be very inspiring, right? Philanthropy can be very inspiring because it does go to the heart of our own values.
It's true. It truly is. And it's also one of the ways, right? Like also mentorship. There are many different ways that characters in Dear Miss Perkins contributed to the greater good. At Mount Holyoke, I mentioned I had 2 jobs in the philosophy department, but I was also funded by a grant from the history department. When I was doing my senior thesis research, I had an Almara fellowship to go back to DC, back into the archives while I was a student here. And then when I was a PhD candidate, a few years later, I benefited from the Skinner Fellowship from the Mount Holyoke Department of History. I'm not sure who funds those, but that was an additional, I think it was $9,000 that year, which contributed significantly toward like my rent and my standard of living at the time. That's a cause that I've benefited from tremendously.
That's fantastic. I think talking about the way that those fellowships, the way that we support student research, is critical to the lives of our graduates is really important. So here at Made Here, we like to ask some signature ending questions of all of our participants. And so I'll ask you those questions now. Are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. So what do you do for fun?
I play acoustic guitar and sing.
You do? Oh,
when
my
I was
goodness.
here, I did the Thirsty Mind open mic every Thursday night, which is no longer a thing. I was also the guitar player for the Jewish Student Union.
Oh, I love that. That's amazing. When did you start playing acoustic guitar?
When I was 11.
That's fantastic.
And I still do, even by myself in my apartment. I hope my next door neighbor doesn't mind, though. He's louder than me, so it's my allowance.
Do you have any hidden talents?
I mean, that's the one that not a lot of people know.
Yeah, that's probably the one that most people don't suspect as a historian, that you also play acoustic guitar.
It's not part of my public profile. I mean, I guess when I was a kid, I wanted to be a rock star, and now I get to travel the country and go into green rooms and then talk about Frances Perkins.
Yes, you're a historian rock star.
Yeah.
You're a rock star, just not maybe the one that you had imagined. So what's one word that your friends would use to describe you?
I asked people this in preparation for this interview. The first ones that I wrote down were bright and passionate, because I think they capture both that I'm like a nice, kind, friendly person, but also ambitious and driven. But then a couple people said tenacious, which I take as a compliment and can be channeled in lots of good directions. And I do think that I'm tenacious.
I love that. What word would a competitor say about you?
I asked them too. Tenacious.
Tenacious. And it's a great word for both of those, for both competitors and friends. So what would the title of your memoir be?
in many cases, the publishing company retitles them, and I would hope that they would in this case. I mean, my joke with friends is, like, if I'm on a road trip or anywhere, I'll say, let's find a place to pee, and that would be the title of my memoir. So hopefully the publishing company would redo it for
I don't know. I feel like that would be a great marketing. No one would ever forget the name of your memoir. That is for sure, if that was the name of it. So if you could go back in time, what piece of advice would you give yourself on the day you graduated from Mount Holyoke?
I mentioned that I like music, and it's a line from Vienna by Billy Joel. You can see where you're wrong, but you can't always see when you're right. You're right. I knew that I wanted to be a historian. I knew that I wanted to live in Washington, D.C. Those were both non-negotiables for me. And even though I don't currently live in Washington, D.C., I have this amazing community there that I built in the first 9 years of my life post-college. It wildly exceeded my hopes and dreams. I had very strong hopes and dreams when I graduated here, and it wildly exceeded them. And I think that it's just characteristic of many Mount Holyoke graduates to have strong intuitive senses of what they want. And maybe they feel that they're supposed to have a career goal and they don't. Well, they have other instincts and intuitions because Mount Holyoke lets us be ourselves. So I think we come out knowing who we are. And I think that my anxiety when I was that age helped me, but I would tell myself then that I had it right and that I did it.
That's fantastic. Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us this
It's
afternoon.
been so fun.
Great to see you.
Thank you.